Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. um, I'll ask our panelists if they can turn on their cameras and microphones. Thank you so much. Um, Scott, Carolyn, Preston, so great to have you here. I have some quick introductions, and then we have a set of questions. So I want to thank everyone for joining us. We have about a good amount of attendees. That's great. Um, this is such an exciting time for structural reform and ranked choice voting. I appreciate you spending an hour with us. FairVote has been conducting a series of these virtual panels on the future of American elections. And there isn't a more timely topic. And we have been talking with some of the most visionary thinkers in electoral reform, thinking about how we create the kind of democracy that lives up to our highest ideals and helps allow for the kind of politics and leadership that we need, especially in this changing moment. This is our 7th conversation. You can find the previous 6 on our YouTube channel, and I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't note that it is Giving Tuesday. So you can visit our website at fairvote.org /donate and make a donation to FairVote. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization, which means donations to FairVote's reform work are tax deductible. And now we're locking the doors to the Zoom so no one can get out. That's a joke. We want you to be involved today. I will pose a set of first questions, and then we'll open it up to you all. If you have questions you would like to ask, please use the question and answer feature on Zoom or the chat function. You can go ahead and leave those at any time. Our FairVote team will be monitoring those fields throughout the conversation. I do want to also reflect on, this year and the election that we just had. 2020 was a big year for ranked choice voting on the ballot. The biggest victory was in Alaska, where voters approved a reform package grounded on FairVote policy innovations on fusing the top 2 primary with ranked choice voting. Earlier this year, Alaska Democrats held one of 5 presidential primaries where ranked choice voting was used. We also saw voters in 6 cities adopt ranked choice voting: Eureka, Albany in California, and in Minnesota, Bloomington and Minnetonka, as well as Boulder, Colorado, in all city offices in Portland, Maine. Today, we are excited to speak with 3 special guests about their respective campaigns. In California, Voter Choice Albany, a group of community members, worked to bring proportional ranked choice voting, which is the proportional representation form of ranked choice voting. It would institute this method of election for city council and school board, and the measure currently leads with 73.3% of voters approving the measure. In Eureka, Yes on C, the Yes on C campaign passed single seat ranked choice voting for its council members who are elected by district, and that measure leads currently with 61.2. And the state of Alaska voted to adopt a measure 2, which would bring several reforms. I have a smiley face with me right there on my text. A top 4 blanket primary for state and congressional offices with ranked choice voting for the general election and ranked choice voting for the presidential election. That measure is currently winning with 50.6%. And Scott, if you have new figures, I'd be curious to know. I'm grateful for today's guest, Preston, Scott, Carolyn. Their leadership on these campaigns is so important if we're going to come together around reforms that make representation better for everyone. Let me introduce them more formally. I'll start with Preston Jordan. He is co-founder of Voter Choice Albany, the Yes on BB campaign. Preston was one of the proponents of Measure BB. Preston is a geologist at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, researching geologic carbon sequestration and was recently just elected to the city council in Albany. In the mid-1990s, he accepted the Jim Lindsay's offer of the red pill, revealing the matrix of plurality at large elections. Jim lives in Albany and co-founded Californians for Electoral Reform. And after watching a council candidate slate win all of the seats in a 2006 Albany election, Preston went all in on seeking to change Albany's method to proportional ranked choice voting. After 12 years of this effort culminating, after 12 years of this effort, he co-founded this group, and voters approved the transition nearly 3-1. Scott, he is campaign counsel for Measure 2 in Alaska. Scott Kendall serves as counsel, and he is an attorney at Holmes, Weddell, and Barcott, and most recently served as chief of staff to then Governor Bill Walker. For decades, Scott has worked across Alaska in a variety of legal, political, and consulting roles. His wife, Selena Hopkins Kendall, was born and raised in Fairbanks, and together they raised their 2 children in Anchorage. Caroline Griffith is an organizer with Measure C in Eureka, California. She is chair of the steering committee for the North Coast People's Alliance and was initially involved in the recent effort to adopt ranked choice voting from conception to election. So folks aren't surprised. I'm going to focus my first set of questions on how these measures got on the ballot. And then in my second set of questions, I'll be asking our panelists about their paths to winning their campaigns. So I'll start with the questions. Preston, let's start with you. You have been an advocate for proportional ranked choice voting in Albany for a number of years. Could you tell us about the education effort your group made before the measure was on the ballot and what it took to get the measure on the ballot this year?
Certainly. First, some context, and thank you, Pedro and FairVote, for hosting this. And just to be clear, I'm not one of those thought leaders, but I try to be, I guess, a lieutenant following the thought leaders. And in that regard, some context about Albany, to call back to the first in this series, there was a reference to cities being the test tubes of democracy while states are the laboratories. I'm not sure Albany's even large enough to be a test tube. It consists of fewer than 20,000 residents living in about 1 square mile. It's a small city that actually is adjacent to Berkeley in California. And being adjacent to Berkeley, there is familiarity with ranked choice here. And Berkeley is adjacent to Oakland, which is adjacent to San Leandro, and all have been using the single seat form or instant runoff voting since 2010. Albany is also in the same county, Alameda County, as those cities, which is quite critical because all the cities have their elections run by the registrar of the county. It's also across San Francisco Bay from San Francisco, which has been using instant runoff voting since 2004. Another salient feature is it is a charter city. A charter is essentially the constitution for a city. Of about 500 cities in California, only about 100 have a charter, and only those cities that have a charter have the power currently under law to even choose ranked choice voting if they want to. Uniquely, as far as I've been able to tell, Albany also has, or at least had, a charter review committee, a standing charter review committee. And I say had because the story that follows after that, the council basically decided to destroy it to keep it from being a source of more good trouble, like ranked choice voting. So the first decade of work on this, there really was no specific education effort. It was really, I led most of the effort for the first decade in training others along the way, and the goal was to get the council to put a measure on the ballot. So I was working within the system, if you will. Initial effort was to get on the charter review committee, which I was successful in doing. That motivated the committee to study election methods, which after years resulted in the committee moving that proportional ranked choice, otherwise known as choice voting or single transferable vote, was the best method for Albany. And staff blocked that recommendation from going to council for a number of years, but we finally overcame that and got the recommendation to council. And council, as well as the school board, because the school board is also under the charter, and council would not act on it. There were 3 members of the 5 who essentially blocked any action. Meanwhile, the school board voted twice unanimously to put it on the ballot. So through all this, in terms of education, while it wasn't a specific education effort, what I call the involved 100 in Albany was getting educated about this issue. And that would pay great dividends later. And it paid dividends in terms of the school board voting twice, asking the council, because only council has the power to put charter amendments on the ballot, to put proportional representation on the ballot. So essentially everybody who was in that involved 100, almost, other than the 3 council members who were opposed, were fairly supportive of ranked choice. But the council not moving, Jim Lindsay then said, look, we need to found a group, a community group to advance this. One of the things that came out during the back and forth with the council was they did an analysis of Albany's historic election results that found that council elections typically had racially polarized voting, which is prohibited by the California Voting Rights Act. Specifically, that means that voters of color in Albany often preferred a different candidate than white voters, but because white voters outnumber voters of color, they essentially exercised a veto, which is illegal under the Voting Rights Act. And so Jim said, like, we can't let this stand. We need to form a group. That's not my forte. That's more his forte, as evidenced by his co-founding Californians for Electoral Reform. And so we did that. I did actually bring Jim and I together with 3 Asian friends of mine, who actually 2 of them are neighbors. So true to sort of Albany ethos, has turned into kind of a block party effort to some degree. And we started up a group. We didn't know what it was called at first. We agreed to bring more people into it. Everybody invited people. I gave presentations on the problem and the solution, and we built the group up to about 20, at which point it took on the name Voter Choice Albany. And one of the new members suggested we go for an initiative, which I was trepidatious about, but we did. And in 1 month, we gathered the equivalent of about half the signatures we needed, and then we got shut down by shelter in place. So that was pretty rough. We pressed the council saying we would have made it. We had another 2 months to go otherwise in collecting signatures. And the council, one of the 3 broke and said, as a matter of fairness, they would support putting it on the ballot. Part of that, and we'll never know, if this is an important part or not, but we told the council that Voter Choice Albany would sue for ballot access if it didn't gain access. So that's some of what we did. I think I'll stop there. I can talk more about what education occurred during the initiative, signature gathering, and how we approached that, because I think there's maybe important lessons there as well.
I think so,
Thanks
too.
So much.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think what I wanted to kind of get from that question is like show that the campaign in Albany was something that was a coalition base. It was a wide coalition. There was a lot of onboarding, your 100 members, the folks you educated on and invested in energy in those relationships. And then you had a coalition that was very diverse and reflective of the Albany community that included API members in Albany as well. So I thought, that's kind of the big strokes that I kind of wanted to make sure that we covered, which I think was great. Thank you, Preston.
Yeah, sure. And if I could just say one more thing. I mean, for my part, I'm a policy wonk, so I'm an introvert. I don't naturally reach out, but in the effort of, that first decade, basically entrained a lot of people, and all those came back as endorsements when we had the measure. So, that's kind of the next phase of the story. But yeah, it was a coalition.
Awesome. Scott, a lot of folks watching might not be familiar with the political dynamics in Alaska. And I note that because ballot measure 2 made several other changes to the elections of the state, particularly in campaign finance, and it changed the primary rules. Could you tell us about the politics of Alaska, what your coalition looked like, and how ranked choice voting became part of that conversation?
Yeah, certainly. So, those who don't know, Alaska's kind of thought of as a red state. It's very much an independent state. Over 62% of our voters don't affiliate with either party, which is by far the highest in the country. So we're different to start with. As background to that, you could discuss Senator Murkowski in 2010. She lost the Republican primary. And I was fortunate enough to work with her when she ran as a write-in candidate and won against both parties. having, requiring people to write her name on the ballot. I was also fortunate enough to be chief of staff to Governor Walker, who was an independent governor who had a Democratic lieutenant governor. So kind of a unity bipartisan administration, which was the only one of its kind in the country. So Alaskans were already sort of like banging on the door of, what the boxes that the electoral process was forcing it into. So following a really ugly 2018 governor's election where we had a three-way race, it was split. It ultimately went to a very, I think most people think the furthest right-wing governor the state's ever had. And it wasn't so much that he won, it was the electoral process that created an inevitability of his win, because if more than one candidate gets in against him, he wins. And so that's what happened. So I and a few other folks just started talking February of 2019. So, very kind of a short process from February through June. I was just thinking about open primaries, like, let's just get this to the top two candidates and have a race and prevent these spoiler races. But that was limiting for Alaska. You might end up with two Republicans. In some races, you might end up with two Democrats. You wouldn't have choices, and most Alaskans don't affiliate as either. So came in contact with some local advocates. I see, Bob Putera from FairVote Alaska is on the call, and he's one of the people I talked to at some point in the process. But the idea of ranked choice, really, I'd heard of it, never really given it much thought. But over the course of the process, that came into the discussion. And then I read the Gail Porter report from Harvard Business School and just kind of realized that we need an election system in Alaska that's kind of manipulation proof. Right now the parties are in all the, have all the control. We have this closed Republican primary that spits out very extreme candidates that are well off the beaten path. And yet when we have kind of a nationally supported Democratic candidate, they have no chance either. And really, Alaskans, whatever you think of it, really do find themselves faced with the lesser of two evils problem. So out of that grew the measure, which we drafted to include open nonpartisan primaries. Top four go on to the general, call it final four voting, and then ranked choice voting in the general election. And then there's also some campaign disclosure and dark money disclosure provisions in there as well. And we filed that as a ballot measure, had a very antagonistic administration. They weren't going to let us gather signatures. They said that violates the single subject rule. We disagreed and went to Superior Court. We won. We got the booklets. We gathered the signatures. They took us to the state Supreme Court. We won there 5-0 and got our signatures. And then really, we were on the cusp of launching a really regional educational in-person campaign, and COVID hit. Literally April 2nd or 3rd was when we were going to launch, and the entire state locked down March 13th, I think it was. And so we had to take a populace that really wasn't, these ideas were foreign to them, and try to educate them virtually in the space of 5 or 6 months, which ultimately it appears we did. And I will report that 50.6 is the final margin. It was certified as final results yesterday. So ballot measure 2 is now the law of the land in Alaska. And that's super important because ballot measures in Alaska, I'm not sure of the law in other states, they're protected constitutionally for 2 years from effective date. So this is the law. It can't be repealed through February or March of 2023. So the 2022 election will be under these rules. So we're really excited about that. We're kind of now turning our attention to implementation and implementation and education and making sure people have a good experience with it so it sticks around. But I think that's at least a rough outline of kind of the initial startup process in the education campaign. A lot of virtual education. The coalition we built was, honestly, we talked to a lot of former legislators. We talked to federal officials. We talked to former governors. And then a huge part of our coalition was the Alaska Native population through organizations, of course. But they, not most people think of it this way, but Alaska is actually the most diverse state in the United States. Nearly 200 languages spoken in public schools here in Anchorage, where I live. Over 40% of the population is non-white. Over 20% of the population is Alaska Native. And so we brought those folks into the fold and said, looking at the data from California, from other places around the country, we think this is a path to BIPOC candidates, women candidates winning and having a path. And, even though Alaska Natives are well over 20% of the population, non-white representation is 16%. and it's just, the system isn't working for you, will you take this chance? And virtually every Alaska Native institution that we spoke with was supportive. So it's really an exciting time here. It's really a lot of marginalized groups and non-party people kind of rose up as a broad, across the spectrum coalition to pass this.
Yeah, it's certainly one of the messages that I feel like it resonates well with voters, especially those who, you know, identify as like a BIPOC community, which is like, well, here's a system that would force candidates to reach out to you for your first, second choice votes, at the very least. Right. So I thank you for that, Scott. Carolyn, Measure C was put on the ballot by the Eureka City Council. I know that the city of Eureka also supported Senate Bill 212, and I worked on that, so that's a shameless plug for us. Could you tell us about your effort and to have the council put the measure on the ballot? Were there any issues, and if so, what were they, and how did you manage those?
Absolutely. So this is something that people had been talking about for a while and have been swirling the idea of doing it. And it just happened that things came together really well in 2018. A few different community groups, North Coast People's Alliance, who I work with, Cooperation Humboldt, our local Central Labor Council, had worked to get a number of council members elected, and we realized that we had a very friendly council. Being a charter city, this is something that we could do to ask the council to refer this to the voters. So not only did we feel like it was a friendly council and we could make it happen, but we were also at a point where the county of Humboldt was going to have to get new voting machines. The voting machines that they had used were no longer certified. So that was an excuse that had been used in the past to not move over to this method, was just that the technology couldn't handle it. So we realized not only did we have council members who would refer this to the voters, we had access to the technology to make it happen. And then actually Senate Bill 212 did kind of play into that as well. These were all different things that we went to the city council and asked them to support. So we did actually go to the council and ask them to support Senate Bill 212, which has brought it into the public consciousness, and we were having that conversation. We did the same thing, bringing it to the Humboldt County Board of Supervisors, with the idea that we did have supervisors who were supportive of ranked choice voting and would have loved to have seen that implemented in non-charter cities and municipalities. So it was another opportunity to bring that forward to people. And then we did have actually the mayor and two of the council members who are elected with our support had run in races where there were more than two candidates running. And so there already had been this kind of clear problem that was laid out, and they understood that and could see the benefit of it. So we started the process of getting the council to do this. And I think like the real problems that we ran into were just process related. We are an entirely volunteer organization. Part of what our mission is to get average citizens involved in these processes. So we were kind of putting our money where our mouth is, and we're like, we don't really know how this works, but we're going to try to make it happen anyway. And our advocates who were on the city council also really didn't understand how the process worked. So there were just some of those missteps, like getting put on the city council agenda in a part of it where the city council actually wasn't allowed to vote on things. So realizing that we'd come and given this informational presentation where we wanted them to make a vote, and they wanted to make a vote, but they actually were not allowed to during that portion of the agenda. So I'm going to come back and do it again. And so it's things like that. And it kind of, you know, Preston was talking about having issues with city staff not moving things forward. And I think that we did have a little bit of that as well, where the council was willing, but not necessarily educated in how the process worked. And then city staff who actually put things together would be like, oh, well, let's just push that off a little bit. Let's push that off a little bit. We got a new city manager who kept pushing it off. The city council ended up firing that city manager. So then there was like an emergency they're dealing with, which put it off. And then COVID hit. So we were like right down at the end of the wire before they finally referred this. And so it did kind of seem like it wasn't going to happen just because of process. And it may have actually been worked out for the best that it happened this way, because there wasn't a lot of opportunity for opposition to arise during this process, and which may have happened if we had been referred to the voters sooner. So, you know, hindsight, we can say it all worked out really great, but there was definitely a moment where we didn't think it was going to happen. And hearing Preston talk, and this is the second time that I've appeared after him, and it made me really realize how easy it was for us. We didn't have to work for a decade. We didn't have to do all of that. And so even though it seemed hard during those 2 years, it was actually a pretty fluid process, thanks to all the work that other people did before us.
Well, my reflection on that is that it seemed like you had your group and your coalition and a base of supporters who were that you had cultural power in that sense, that you were able to basically get the city council to move with you, which I thought was really impressive. It just kind of shows like what kind of power exists out there and how to leverage that power wherever you can.
Absolutely. And now it's making us think of what we can do next. And definitely that coalition of people were like, wow, we did that. What else can we do?
Awesome. I'm going to go to our second set of questions. I'm going to try to ask my questions really fast now because I want to make sure we have enough time to get through everyone. Preston, the success of Measure BB marks the first time in about 80 years that proportional ranked choice voting was passed in a substantive big way. It was part of a Parks Rec Board in Minneapolis of an earlier measure, but this is the first time we see proportional ranked choice voting be used and passed for city council and school board. Can you tell us a little bit about, your campaign opponents? Can you tell us about your field effort, what that looked like, and what the message was for voters?
Yeah, definitely. So to go back to the signature gathering, because I think that's really was the beginning of really winning on the ballot. As I mentioned, there are multiple cities in the Bay Area that have been using ranked choice for quite a long time, and so we took a message from the Santa Clara campaign, which was a few years ago for ranked choice, which was not successful, and the canvassers that went door to door there said, what they found is they just mentioned ranked choice. A large percentage of voters said, oh yeah, I'm on board. So don't make it too complicated. So I know when I was gathering signatures, we put together a script where we used that finding. And so I would go to a door and say, we're gathering signatures for ranked choice, and about 40% of the voters would sign right there. And then someone would say, oh, well, so what's ranked choice? And I would just explain, well, you get to cheat and rank the candidates. And then, like another 30% signed. So we got 70% signing. So because there'd been so much education done by ranked choice, albeit single seat being used in the area, the community was really primed for it. In terms of opposition, part of, I think, operating in a smaller than test tube, we did have opposition, but did not run an organized campaign. It purely consisted of one of the council members and a couple other community leaders writing a ballot argument against it, and there was really nothing else that we saw. So that was pretty remarkable. We had a wide open field. The council also did not put a districting measure on the ballot to compete, which is a move that has torpedoed proportional ranked choice other places. As far as the messaging, this may seem trite, but we chose the campaign colors of red, white, and blue, rah-rah, democracy. Not that this is like a real rah-rah kind of place, but nonetheless sort of set that tone. And then Pedro's being modest because he joined the campaign, and he really brought a lot of, national level understanding and expertise. And so he suggested the campaign theme, more choices, more voices, based on focus group testing. And so that was the theme that was picked up and chosen by the voters. And so that was replicated and expanded upon in all the literature. The first pieces include a sample ballot to, again, reinforce, hey, this is pretty straightforward. It's not a scary thing. We also had, again, with I think really with Pedro's good prodding, it was the first campaign literature ever in Albany that had any Chinese or Spanish language on it. And in the mailer that went to every household, we explicitly said this will improve representation for different classes and races. So right now, Albany City Council is 100% white homeowners. And the last time there was a renter on the council, for instance, was in the 90s. The last time there was a non-white on the council, a person of color, was about 12 years ago, but Albany is 40% people of color. So we really made that explicit. And that was interesting for me because I was trying to do it just based on sort of the broader diversity of, however the voters decide what diversity is, whether it be ideological, class, geographic. But everybody else on the campaign rightly said, no, we have to make this about race and class. And so it's like, okay, we're making it about race and class. And so that turned out to obviously be successful. And then finally, Pedro and the volunteer coordinator, Irene Tate, led nightly phone banking. And the phone banking, again, credit to Pedro, was of a style that really was more of a conversation than just kind of a push message to voters. So it really engaged voters in conversation. And, you know, try to share with them how inclusive democracy could be and should be, and that we would get better results as a community if we did that. So all those components, and, you know, there were other logistical mechanics of door pieces and mailers and all that, but I think I'll leave it there.
Awesome, thanks. And I'll if there's an opportunity, I can talk about more about the script, but I want to move on to my next question for Scott. Scott, in 2020, the Alaskan Democratic primary used ranked choice voting to elect its presidential nominee. Then in the months preceding the November election, your campaign faced some tough opposition, meaning that, like, we heard about it over here, right? What impact did ranked choice voting have during the primary have on the campaign? Like, what impact did that experience have on the campaign? And how did you overcome that opposition messaging?
Yeah, so, you know, as discussed, you know, most Alaskans are in the middle, and we kind of had our win number, and we knew we had to convince, you know, obviously the majority of nonpartisans, but we had to get a chunk of Republicans and we had to get a chunk of Democrats, or we just couldn't win. Like, to get the margins we need, you know, starting from the premise of about 1/3 of all Alaska voters, maybe more than that, vote no absolutely on every ballot measure. So, you know, there's just a group of people, like, they vote no on the judges. You know, your persuadable universe is really 65% because you've already lost 35. And so knowing that, we knew we had to pull out of every bucket. And what we had late in the game, and our win margin really should have been something like 55, 56, but we did have organized opposition, and they were organized and financed from the right. And we knew that, and we had kind of baked that in. But what happened late to us was we got concerted organized attack from the left. And, you know, they had, you know, kind of the crown jewel of the attack on the left was former Senator Mark Begich, who had also been the most recent candidate for governor as a Democrat, and Planned Parenthood. And they absolutely hammered the progressive base with robocalls, with texts saying Mark Begich and or Planned Parenthood are asking you to vote no. And we just started bleeding support on that side because people assume they know what they're talking about. If Planned Parenthood says vote no, it must be bad for choice. It's not. It's actually good for choice, but for their own political reasons, they had aligned with Senator Begich. So one of the things that helped blunt that, of course, was the Democratic Party's very successful use of ranked choice voting in the presidential primary. They'd used it. They had great results, great satisfaction, big contrast to 2016 when they had you know, a huge rift between Hillary and Bernie people like many states had. People were happy with how it went, and turnout was roughly double what they normally have for a presidential primary. So baked into all the Democrats' heads was, why is this a bad thing? Why is this good enough for us, but not good enough for the rest of the state? And so I think that resonated and blunted the attacks. The other things we did was, as they hit us, you know, they had Governor Dunleavy, the leading Republican in the state. They had the state Republican Party. They had the former Republican governor. They had the Democratic candidate for Governor Mark Begich. They had us in a vice, and they're hitting us from both angles. And what we started to do is just starting at the mayor level and state representative and state senator level up, just getting endorsements from people who were kind of closest to the voters. And a big one for us was Speaker of the House, Bryce Edgman. He's Alaska's first Alaska Native Speaker of the House. He's a political independent. And we just saw our numbers with Alaska Native voters, and we have kind of 4 rural Alaska Native predominant districts. And our numbers in those just went through the roof based on him saying this is the right way forward. Another thing we did, which was, you know, maybe too clever, Senator Tom Begich, who's a state senator, who is the brother of Mark Begich, endorsed us. So, and then Senator Mark Begich's son, Jacob, endorsed us. So we started, you know, 2 out of 3 Begiches endorsed us anyway. So we started just kind of this ground game of bringing, and you know, frankly, in retrospect, we would have put more energy into that earlier because we saw remarkable things when the ballots were counted. For example, Representative Louise Stutz, she represents Kodiak, It's a fisherman, very blue collar, kind of rural district, very Republican. She's a Republican. We took 70% out of that district because Louise Stutes herself was a vocal proponent of what we, so kind of against what you'd assume by the political complexion of that district. It was almost as though just having validators at that level that people identified with was probably our most powerful tool. So we started rolling out, at some point we were rolling out mayors, we were rolling out prominent eye doctors and dentists. We didn't even care anymore. We were throwing up 10, 12, 15 endorsements a week, promoting them. And it was very effective from what we can tell.
Thank you. Carolyn, Eureka is now one of 6 California cities that have passed ranked choice voting for municipal elections. To me, that demonstrates an appetite for reform in our state. Your campaign also faced the challenge of having to social distance along with the other campaigns and the threat, but in your situation, also the threats of, the wildfires that hit Northern California. Given all of the conditions that your campaign faced, how were you able to reach voters, and what tactics and messages do you think resonated most?
It was very difficult, and not just with COVID, and so much of our campaigning involves going door to door. That's a huge thing that we do. And as both of these fellows have said, like having that actual conversation with people is what helps them to understand the benefit of this. So I think that we were very lucky that we had done previous education and that we had built the coalitions that we had. I think that was huge to our success, but also that the people, it's obvious to me that the people of Eureka were ready for this as well. And this is something that it actually, I was disappointed by how low our numbers are right now, because I think that if we'd had the opportunity to have more conversations with people, we would be closer to that 70% yes rate. But a lot of what we did, there was a lot of social media. We were really lucky also to have a huge amount of support from labor in the area. And so they just have that connection with all of their members. And so it was very easy to reach all of those folks. We have also, we got the support of the local Democratic Party, which was huge, which would not have happened a couple of years ago, but they've recently had some turnover in their leadership. So that helped to reach out to people. And we have been a part of a larger coalition of groups over the last few years that has candidate forums as well. So we bring all the candidates for city council together and ask them questions about our missions. And it just so happened that this year, both of the wards where there were council members up for election, one of them had 3 people running, the other had 5 people running. So it was just a ready-made argument for why we need this. And so to make that a campaign issue, and a number of those people who were running were supportive of Measure C. And so they were taking that message out when they were talking to voters as well. But what seems to resonate, what I heard from people after the fact, what they thought was very helpful were, we did some radio ads that were just very, no nonsense, where it was like, here's a problem and here's a solution. And it's also really easy, and a lot of other people do it. And so I think that those messages, the fact that this is not a new crazy thing, that it can help solve this problem that we all see, and that so many other people are doing it, it's just not a big deal. I think that was really helpful. We have one of the, I think one of the last really functional cable access stations in the country too, which has multiple TV stations. So we did some cable access informational stuff too, which gets out there to a lot of people. A lot more than I normally would think, said that they saw our stuff on cable access. So that was also helpful. But I think really the message that we have a problem and here's a really easy solution. And with all of the other problems that we had in this last season that don't have obvious solutions, people were like, hey, this is great, let's do it.
Yeah, I'll add that some of the folks at the Board of Supervisors actually had a really compelling message that I heard, which was in the case of replacing runoff elections, that for supervisors in California, we have contingent runoffs. So if someone can get over 50% +1 in a low turnout primary, and they don't have to face a November electorate, right? What happens when someone gets, when an incumbent loses in that June election or that March election? Well, you basically have, I don't like the word lame, but you have a lame duck incumbent for 9 months who's completely unaccountable to the voters. And I found that to be like super strong argument coming out of Humboldt County. And I was like, you all up there are thinking of some really great, just like thinking about power and how, have making a lot of sense as to why to have reforms like this. So
yeah, and we have because we have clear examples too, like that one in particular. Like we did recently have a supervisor who lost in the primary and then continued to serve out his term until the following year. So to be able to see the clear problem is very helpful, I think.
Right. So before we move on to audience questions, I want to acknowledge again that today is Giving Tuesday. And if people are feeling inspired, and want to support, efforts like this, FairVote is like, we're putting together a library to kind of make available resources for campaigns and local campaigns. And if the campaigns themselves have a website too, they can feel free to drop it on the on the chat below. But we're going to put our link for folks as well in the chat feature. If you're feeling generous and want to support the groups that are doing this work on the ground and also the work the FairVote is doing, that'd be great. Thanks so much. Let's look at the questions here. And I will admit that the panelists did a great job at responding to some of the questions in the chat. So some of the questions we won't put up here, but if folks feel like they want to bump up that for the recording, just let me know in a private message. Scott, you had a great statement and people wanted to make sure that they captured it correctly. You said that your organizers thought that you needed a system that was influence-free, manipulation-free.
Yeah, and there's kind of two things I'm referring to there. The first being the parties here, maybe, I don't know, I don't live in another state, but they demand obedience to a degree where we had 6 or 7 longtime Republican incumbents, very popular, very conservative, not, wasn't as though they weren't conservative enough, but they have disobeyed the party by working together with Democrats and independents. And the party targeted them, and in a closed primary universe, I think one of them was unelected, even though only 5% of his constituents voted against him, but it was enough in a low turnout closed primary. And so that's kind of problem number one, is that the parties stand between the voters and the public officials. And the public officials, because of redistricting in our state and there being only maybe 7 or 8 competitive seats, the primary is the race and the parties control public officials. So breaking that. And then the second thing is Alaska very famously has third-party candidates, spoiler candidates, and many candidates for office in Alaska run with a specific strategy of, I'm going to run and I'm going to encourage that green candidate to run because they'll shave off X amount from the Democrat. Or I'm going to run and I'm going to encourage that libertarian candidate to run because that's going to shave off X% from the Republican. And so we had, again and again, and until this year, with Senator Sullivan's reelection, we hadn't had a U.S. Senate candidate achieve a majority since 2002. That was kind of the rule and not the exception. Was people won their seats with 40%, 42%. When I worked with Senator Murkowski and she ran a write-in campaign, she won with 39%. I'm glad she won, but any system under which you're electing people with 30-some% is a system that's rife for failure. We came very close to someone being elected in that campaign, for example, that it's fair to say if you added first and second choices, 65% of the state wanted someone else. And yet that was what First Past the Post allowed, was manipulation by putting people in the race just for the point of spoiling the race.
Great. And I wanted to just quickly answer this question. How does ranked choice voting help with the problem of the lame duck incumbent loser from Joseph? I just wanted to create clarity is that instead of having that two-round election, you can have one election when turnout is highest in November, which is what one of the options that Senate Bill 212 would allow. And one of the things that one of the supervisors, Mike Wilson, warned everyone about would happen, and it happened in Humboldt. So that's so that's what I'm referring to, is that you could get that 50% plus one majority in a higher turnout election in November was one of the arguments that was pitched. I want to actually ask this question of everyone, and that is just like about the kind of public outreach. I mean, we've talked about this, but like, were there any strategies that you thought were especially helpful this election season, given all of the conditions, and things you felt like were like, oh, aha moments that you want to make sure that other activists and people who are thinking about bringing reform to where they are considering? And what advice do you have for them? We can start with Preston, and then Carolyn, and then Scott.
Yeah, so for my part, I guess I assessed at the outset of taking on any issue of, which is this one that I took on, the opportunity landscape. How likely is an all-in effort to succeed? What are the factors? I learned this term from Pedro's SWOT analysis, which is what strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. I didn't do that formally, but that's sort of informally where I've come to in my advocacy practice. And so I assessed that Albany passed that test, again, because it's in a county with other cities that use ranked choice and have been using ranked choice. And because those are charter city, all those factors I mentioned earlier. So I would encourage people to be realistic. To me, in my advocacy experience, I found that if I choose half the number of issues to work on, I succeed on a larger number of absolute issues than if I work on twice as many issues. Because when you choose to work on an issue, you need to have somebody in your group at every meeting where that issue is touched. If you want to succeed, you have to be all in. And at least in Albany, with that approach, my batting average is like 700, which is pretty remarkable. So again, I would just encourage taking a realistic look at your landscape, and are you the right place to try this? What are the strengths? What are the weaknesses? And then once you make a decision to go for it, just go psycho, go crazy, go all in, do everything you possibly can do. And also don't get too caught up in who shows up to work with you and who doesn't. Just put out as many feelers as you can. And, you put out 100 feelers and maybe 10% of the people respond and show up. And, it's amazing what you can do with a few really committed people. So just put it out there. Thanks.
Carolyn?
I think that in hindsight, what really worked well was the fact that we had been educating and building the coalition for so long on all these different ranked choice voting things. So it just became a part of the conversation. I think that no matter what, that would have been good, but the fact that we had done all that while we were still having in-person meetings, that it had been something that we had been talking about before then, really helped us to transition to the digital world, because we'd already had those in-depth conversations with people who could then take that message out there. I think that there is a pretty special thing that's been happening in Humboldt County over the last few years, where there is a lot more of that coalition building happening. And so we really did have the support and trust of a lot of people, which made it easier. So we didn't have to, it's not like we were pitching this crazy new thing to them as, people that they didn't trust. They're like, well, we know this group and we trust them. So maybe this thing that they're talking about isn't quite so crazy. So I think that was huge. And to realize after the fact that there were a lot of those people that, even though we weren't necessarily working hand in hand with them in the campaign, they were still out there pitching it because we had brought them on before, we'd educated them before. So I think really can't stress that enough, especially because this is something that is, it appeals to people all across the political spectrum. I feel like with a lot of other political campaign things, you tend to be like, well, these are our people and we just go to them. Whereas this is something that can appeal to everybody. So it really was an opportunity to broaden the coalition and bring more people in.
And Scott, I'm going to weave in, I want you to respond with best advice that you have for folks, but I'm going to weave in this question that we got from someone. how important was it that ranked choice voting was in a package with other reforms on the ballot? Because you mentioned the single issue conflict that you had earlier that you were able to overcome. So I understand that only certain states can do that, but perhaps you can kind of talk about that more in that dynamic and whether or not having more than one reform in a package kind of helped.
Yeah, so I think it helped and it hurt. It hurt in the fact that more issues, more complexity. It was packaged, both in court and to the public as election reform. We don't have the solution to your problem, but we're going to give you the tools to make things better. Just, are you angry at the status quo? Let's fix it. So I think it did, it added complexity. We couldn't just talk about ranked choice voting. We had to talk about dark money and campaign finance, which is its own Byzantine labyrinth. And we had to talk about this idea of an open top 4 primary, which no state has done. That being said, if you're tiring people out with ranked choice voting, you got kind of a sweetener where you can talk about, but isn't dark money bad? Or don't you agree these closed primaries are bad? And so you really did have to, I think like I said, I think it helped and it hurt. I think we had plenty of folks, particularly on the progressive side, who loved ranked choice voting, who said, no, I want a Democratic primary. I want a Democratic candidate. And so they objected on those bases. But we just, frankly, we thought about it like engineers. We said, what is the system that is going to solve all these problems at once? We don't want to solve half the problem and then have manipulation of a pure ranked choice system happen. We don't, through the closed primary system, and we don't want to fix the closed primary system and then still leave plurality voting that's going to still have spoilers and still have issues. So that was why. There's certainly some people who accused us of, well, you talked about dark money because that's popular, and you basically, that was your loss leader in order to get people in the door. I think it started conversations, but I will say the one thing I'm proud of our campaign about is every event we went to, we explained this thing soup to nuts, honestly, transparently. We gave the data, and we just let people make up their own minds. If they were only willing to talk to us because we were talking about dark money, great, but we sold them the whole sandwich. So, that's kind of the take on that. If there was a bit of advice I would give people, and maybe I didn't take my own advice, so that's why I know it's good advice, is give yourself more time. We didn't even there wasn't even a germ of an idea of this effort until February of 2019. There was no public visibility. We talked to thought leaders and others. There was no public visibility that we were even doing this until August of 2019, when we filed it with Lieutenant Governor. And really no public awareness until they threw us out and we sued them in, I think, September or October of 2019. And then we had an issue where the legislative session here runs from January through April, typically, and a legislature can void a ballot measure if they pass something that's called, quote, substantially similar. And the legislature in the past has done this. They've either done a watered down version of something that takes out critical elements, but it's about 55% the same, so it's enough to kill the ballot measure, or they pass and repeal, because ballot measures have the 2-year protection, legislation doesn't. And we've had this happen in the past. Alaska had it was 15 years ago or so, a minimum wage ballot measure. The legislature passed it, and then 2 months later repealed it before it ever became effective. And so we decided to just go radio silent for January through April. We don't want the legislature messing with us. We got to sneak up on people. It's the only way we're going to pass this. In hindsight, boy, as we got late in the campaign, I was like, I'd sure like those 4 months back where we were silent. But we really, in terms of a formal education campaign where we spoke to, not just thought leaders, but broad swaths of Alaskans, we didn't start till April or May 2020. And that's a demanding schedule. And then you throw COVID on top of it. So I guess I would say start much, much earlier, give yourself more time. We did it, but my goodness, don't do that to yourself. And then the final point, I'd reflect on Caroline's point, which is everyone's on the menu. With these kind of reforms, don't go to your progressive friends only, don't go to your moderate friends only, go to everyone. I spent hours and hours with the chair of the Republican Party for the state. He ultimately opposed it, but we won 30 to 35% of Republicans for a reason, because we went to them and said, this is just a better way to make decisions. It's not going to help Democrats. It's not going to help you for that matter, but it's a better, more rational way to make decisions. And frankly convinced a lot of people across the spectrum. So I think that's an important thing to remember. Don't speak to the echo chamber. Don't speak to people who inherently tend to agree with you. Go to everyone.
Yeah, I'll agree. And you know, Albany is probably very politically different than Alaska in certain ways, but we also, the campaign had developed a message that was pretty much for everybody. And that seemed to work out well for Albany. And I'd be curious to know what experiences you had with that. But we are out of time. I want to thank our panelists for their thoughtful responses. I think we all learned a little bit of like under the hood of these campaigns. I mean, all of this work happened, and you know, we have victories to celebrate now, but what happened in the work involved before that, I think is only part, you know, the victory is only part of the story, like what happened before and all that work and all that stress and all those hours put in. You know, winning a campaign takes work. And I want to thank the folks who joined us today to kind of share the stories that they had. And the opportunity to have this discussion. We'll be posting the recording of our this on our YouTube page by tomorrow morning, and I also hope that you'll join us on some future webinars. And I can give you 2 minutes of your day back. Thank you.
I would just like to close real quick and say thank you, everybody, and so lovely to see Caroline again. It's only the second time I've seen her, and Scott, lovely to meet you. It's always great to see other ranked choicers, because I know it can be, well, at least for me, it was somewhat isolating at times. So it's like, yeah, there's other crazy people out there. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right.